Let's talk about oxygen transport to the tissues. Just for quick review, oxygen moves from the lungs to the tissues. I have a big toe right here, but it includes all the tissues and all the cells of the body. Certainly, some cells and tissues are more metabolically active than others. As a result, they're going to be in higher need of oxygen. But oxygen is going to be perfused throughout the whole body. So let's take a look at how this works. So first we have hemoglobin molecule, which we've talked about in a previous video. Oxygen is poorly soluble in water. As a result, only roughly 2% of all our oxygen gets transported directly in the blood plasma, where there's a super high concentration of water. Most of it is bound to the hemoglobin molecule, where it binds specifically to the iron-containing atom of the heme group, as we see right here. Now, if we just look at a brief overview of the travel of oxygen throughout the body, it first enters the body from the atmosphere, moving into the lungs, specifically into the air sacs of the lungs, known as alveoli. And gases move down pressure gradients in a very similar manner, where ions or molecules move down chemical or electrical gradients. So there's going to be a higher concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere than in the alveoli. That's what will cause oxygen to move into the alveoli. Certainly, I'm leaving out the dynamics of respiration, which certainly impact this. But for now, let's just suggest, which is accurate, oxygen will move down its pressure gradient into the air sacs of the lungs, known as alveoli. From there, it'll move from the alveoli into the blood plasma down its partial pressure gradient, which generally at the lungs, if not always at the lungs, there's going to be a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the blood plasma than in the air sacs or the alveoli. From the blood plasma, most of it, 98% of it's going to go into the red blood cell and bind to the hemoglobin molecule. Certainly, as I suggested previously, roughly 2% is going to remain in the blood plasma and travel to the tissues. Once we get to the tissues, that 2% of oxygen is going to leave the blood plasma and enter the tissues and the cells, which is the whole goal here. Once the blood plasma concentration of oxygen has decreased, oxygen will leave the hemoglobin molecule, the red blood cell, move into the plasma, and then directly into the tissues and cells. So let's take a closer look at this. Factors that impact the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. One, I just suggested the partial pressure gradient of oxygen, and that's a huge factor in this. But there are other conditions that impact the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. One of them is CO2. Now, one thing I've always stressed, and I continue to stress, at the forefront of your consciousness when you're thinking about physiological processes, we need to be thinking about the cellular respiration equation. Glucose plus oxygen is going to give us CO2, water, heat, and ATP. Certainly, the goal is ATP, CO2, and heat are merely byproducts, but increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Once again, carbon dioxide is a gas, so we reference it with regards to partial pressure. Increase in partial pressure of CO2 at the tissues will stimulate the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. And hopefully that makes sense, because if there is an increase in CO2 at the tissues, that must mean those tissues are metabolically active and they consumed oxygen to make that CO2, really to make ATP. But once again, CO2 is a byproduct of that process. A decrease in pH will also stimulate the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. We've articulated previously that CO2 and the hydrogen ion are significantly related to each other. As CO2 increases in the body or in the tissues, it's going to react with water, make carbonic acid, dissociate into bicarbonate, and the hydrogen ion, which will decrease pH of that region. So a decrease in pH will also stimulate the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Temperature, the same rationale here. The more ATP we make, the more oxygen we're consuming, the more heat we are producing. So increased temperature at the tissues is going to stimulate the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. These first three are directly related to each other because, once again, if you remember your cellular respiration equation, that creates carbon dioxide. We're going to get an increase in carbon dioxide, a correlated decrease in pH, and we will also get an increase in temperature. The fourth one is a molecule known as 2,3-biphosphoglycerate, which is a glycolytic intermediate. That is to say, the process of glycolysis, which produces ATP. In that process, this molecule, 2,3-biphosphoglycerate, will be produced. And it's going to be produced in much higher concentrations when we are producing ATP anaerobically. Keep in mind, if we are low on oxygen, we are utilizing anaerobic glycolysis to make ATP. And the more anaerobic glycolysis that is occurring, the more 2,3-biphosphoglycerate is going to be produced, which will stimulate the release of oxygen from hemoglobin. Next video, we'll talk about the transport of CO2, which is more complex than that of oxygen.